Okay. So as promised, what are we doing today? We're talking about how to write a Cambridge essay, right? Specifically the way Cambridge wants you to write it. You've all had your language arts classes. I hope in those language arts classes at some point there was some conversation about how to write an essay, right? And this is one of these weird situations because the Cambridge exam at the end of the year is what kind of an exam? It's an essay, right? So we gotta talk about essay writing. We gotta play the role of language arts teacher, at least for a certain time in this class, because it so happens that's the way the exam is. This is not so much a question of being able to retain the knowledge necessary for this course, but also how do you transfer that effectively into a written format, an essay. So because of the change of schedule, it was supposed to be Wednesday. We have PSAT, so it's gonna be actually on Friday, okay? So Friday, what I'm gonna do, everybody sits down, I'm gonna hand you your booklets back. Remember the booklets? In these booklets, you're gonna write your essay down. What are we gonna simulate? Well, it makes no sense back, in years prior, we would do a paper one simulation. That doesn't make any sense. I don't think doing a paper one this early in the year makes any more sense because of the syllabus and the nature of the syllabus and the fact that the topic for paper one rotates on a yearly basis. So we're gonna do paper two. And we're not even gonna do an entire paper two. We're gonna do half of paper two. In data chats with the administration, and this has been year after year, what keeps popping up is that students do less well on paper two than they do on paper one. And so what do you think the solution for that is? Spend more time on paper two. Improve my students' ability to respond to paper two questions. So that's what we're gonna do. So, some basics. There's a big difference between paper one and paper two. Namely that paper two is made up of FRQs. What does that mean? Anybody knows what FRQs are?
Free response questions.
Free response questions. And that kind of gives us an explanation of why students do less well on paper two than paper one. There's no source. There's nothing there to lean on. Whatever you put down on that paper needs to come, there's only one place it can come from. And what's that?
Your memory?
Whatever you were able to retain as far as course content that can help you answer this question. So yeah, they are more challenging, all right? If you remember what I've told you in the past, paper two is 3 sets of questions. Of these 3 sets, you pick 2, and each one of these 2 sets is made up of how many prompts? 2 prompts. So you're doing an A and a B and an A and a B. Remember, it's 2 units. Each unit is made up of 2 prompts. You're answering A, B, A, B. A and B are very different types of prompts. So 145 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, to answer 4 prompts. That's if we were doing, the full paper 2 simulation. We're not doing that. Okay, we're only going to do 2 prompts, meaning I don't need 145 minutes. What's half of 145? Yes?
Maria Reynaldo going home.
Okay. What's half of 145 minutes?
72.
It's about 75 minutes, something like that. I hope our math is right here. If not, I'm gonna seem pretty foolish because I'm recording this, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah.
72.5.
72.5. Okay, we're gonna say we round up, okay? Because I'm gonna give you 60 minutes to do this. So I'm actually gonna give you a little less time to answer 72 to 2 prompts. Okay. Bye-bye. $72.5 you say, right?
Yeah.
72.5 minutes to answer 2 prompts. double check that information. It may not be an hour and 45 minutes, it may be an hour and 15 minutes, 75 minutes. Anyways, I think that's what it is. Right, so that's embarrassing. I think it's an hour and 15 minutes, so that'll be 75 minutes in total. Anyways, so you're gonna do an A or B. I'm already picking the unit for you, which is gonna be the unit we just finished, unit 1. All right. Anybody remember what's the difference between an A prompt and a B prompt? Nobody? All right, let's refresh your memory. And we'll talk about these diagrams later on. So just suppose, I threw this question at you. With every expectation that you've read everything that you've needed to read about Unit 1, and you're perfectly capable of answering these questions. Could you? If I were to throw this at you, surprise today, could you answer these questions? Maybe you could. Let's break it down. Let's look at prompt A. First of all, let's ask what kind of an essay do we respond with? And we can tell by the wording of the question. Explanatory. What gives you the clue there?
Explain.
The word explain. If you see the word explain, or you see the word why as an operative term, the type of essay you respond with is a expository essay. Pretty easy. All you gotta do is explain. In fact, it's so easy that Cambridge lets you know it's easy, because what do you think these numbers represent?
The points.
Points. Why do you think Cambridge would give A half the number of points it would give B?
It's not as hard.
Because they're aware that it's not as hard. It should be relatively easy to you. That's an expository essay. A prompts. You always answer A prompts with an expository essay. What about B prompts? How's this different? Why do you think it's worth twice as much?
You add your opinion with the...
And what you know.
Yeah, kinda, sorta. Anybody else want to take a stab at it? Look at the wording of this question. What's the setup? Is there an argument being set up in this question?
Yeah.
Yes. What exactly are we arguing over?
If the Kansas-Nebraska Act was increasing sectional divide.
That the Kansas-Nebraska Act was not just increasing, was the
Main
cause. That's a big difference. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the main cause of the sectional divide during those years. The wording of the question is setting up an argument. If that's the setup, then okay, we could go two ways with this, right? We could say either
Yes.
it was the main cause, or no. And so what kind of essay do you think we're going to write? And which you're going to explore both options.
Argumentative.
An argumentative essay. Here we write an expository essay. We explain why, in this case, Dred Scott case caused controversy. B, we write an argumentative essay in which we present an argument in favor of Kansas-Nebraska being the main cause, a rebuttal that challenges that notion, and then we end with what you said, not really so much an opinion, but our judgment / evaluation of these two arguments compared to each other. Yes?
Since it's like argumentative, is there like no wrong answer? You prove it like with facts?
That's a good way of putting it. I mean, there's, as long as your facts are straight, and as long as you are clearly presenting, this is the argument for, this is the rebuttal against, okay? The final paragraph, we haven't gotten there yet, but it's, of the two, this is the most valid, then yes, there's no way to get it wrong per se. The only way to get it wrong per se is you're not doing the right thing. Or whatever facts you are presenting as evidence are incorrect. All right? So I would say, could we take a stab at this? Let's look at A first. We'll come back to this question. And let's talk about basic essay writing and how can we use basic essay writing as a way to, for example, write an expository essay. Has any teacher of yours in the past ever gone over the hamburger method? It's classic, it's traditional, just like every teacher does it, all right? So let's write this here on the board. So A is expository, we know this. And B is argumentative. That you need to know. That's part of those predictability factors of Cambridge that kind of give us a certain amount of benefit. We know that A will always be expository, we know that B will always be argumentative, we know that A will always be worth 10 points, and we know that B will always be worth twice as much, and therefore we could expect it to be a little bit more challenging. Hamburger method. So let's talk about that. I guess it's an analogy that works with American students. If we lived somewhere else, we would have to pick something else as an analogy. But the idea is you could put together an essay kind of like a hamburger, as in if you connect the correct parts where they're supposed to go, the final product is something that makes sense. All the different parts complement one another, all right? So do you remember that first question? Let's play along. Explain why the Dred Scott decision was a controversial. Let's try to answer it together as a class. Give me a reason. Give me a reason why you feel this way.
Because now, like, the northern blacks feel like they don't have the rights either. Like, because constitutionally, the Supreme Court said that they don't have rights.
I'll come back to this. All right, so our first reason, and I'm going to put a letter C, our first claim, is that Northern African Americans apparently have no constitutional rights. What's another reason that the Dred Scott case might have caused controversy? Other than that.
Didn't it say that the Missouri Compromise line was unconstitutional or something like that?
Yeah, because you couldn't tell slave owners that they had property rights here, not property rights there. That was their argument, right? They either had property rights in the entire country, or they didn't, all right? So what do we say there? Property rights of slave owners in question? Or extended the property rights of slave owners? Let me put that in quotes, okay? Because that was their arguments, right? Not just the Missouri Compromise, you could also say the same thing as in Kansas, Nebraska. It's like, okay, that's fine and great, but you can't tell me that I have property rights in one part of the country and tell me that I don't have property rights in the other, when the Fifth Amendment says that the state cannot deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So their argument is Missouri Compromise should never existed. All right, so those are our two reasons. So how do we open this expository essay? With a statement, an opening statement. All right, so let's get one thing off the bat when it comes to Cambridge. This is not language arts. This is not creative writing. They're not looking for the next great American writer. They're not looking for some flowery introduction. They're looking for somebody that does what? Get to the point. Which allows me to address another question. Mister, is there a word count? No. The word count is not what you should be worrying about. You know what you should be worrying about? Could I pull this thing off in the amount of time being given to me? That's what you should worry about, not about a word count. Okay? So, knowing that, how should I start? As direct and as concise as possible. This is my opening statement in which I am addressing the prompt in a very general way. I'll get into specifics later when I get into the body of my essay. So give me an example of a thesis statement. Anybody? Okay, I'll help you. The Dred Scott case was a controversial decision in this country because it threatened the rights of Northern African Americans as well as threatened to expand the property rights of slaveholders throughout the territories. Bam. Period. There's your thesis statement. What do we do next? Now we have to go into what? Greater detail. Now we elaborate. So we got our bun. All right? We got our bun. What comes next? So here's another question. Some of your teachers taught you the hamburger method. How many of your teachers, it sounds immature a little bit, but I guess it helps. How many of your teachers ever taught you to pee on your papers? Sounds silly, but that's for, remember silly things. What exactly did that mean?
Point, evidence, explanation.
Point, evidence, explanation. You make a point, and it kind of travels in a circle, right? It's not going to show up in the video. You make a point. You reinforce the point by providing evidence. And an FRQ, your evidence is not going to be a quote because there's no source to draw evidence from. Your evidence is going to be what? It's going to be what?
An example.
An example. Historical fact. And then, through your explanation, you demonstrate how this evidence proves your initial point. Okay? You make a point. In this case, our first point is what? Dred Scott stripped away the constitutional rights or the assumed constitutional rights of whom? Northern African Americans. Okay? Provide examples. What would be a good example to provide, to back this statement up? So what are we doing? That's our first claim. We're building the hamburger. Right? After my thesis statement. Okay? Dred Scott decision, stripped away any potential constitutional rights from free blacks and Northern African Americans. For example, what was already law? And now this added further fuel to this law. The Fugitive Slave Act. It further authorized, or further, what's the right word we're looking for? Justified the use of slave owners to go into the North, and it quite often kidnapped free blacks and sell them into slavery, because after all, what did the Supreme Court say?
They don't have rights.
Yeah. And so how does that, then here's where you elaborate, right? How does an example like that, the Fugitive Slave Act, come back and prove that this is true? That it took away the rights of African Americans in the North and the African Americans that have been emancipated.
That Dred Scott was kidnapped and that he was a free black.
Well, he believed himself to be. Okay. Remember, this is not really specific about Dred Scott. The question is the Dred Scott case. How did it create controversy? So now we move on to the second claim. Right? And what's the second claim? How do we start a second claim? What's a good phrase? So here's a couple of things to address. Please don't write one long continuous paragraph. They should have taught you that in your language arts class, right? When you are shifting gears, shifting topics, if you will, you're expected to do what? To what? indent and create a new paragraph. Stylistically, grammatically, this is the correct thing to do. Okay? And is there a phrase that stylistically would also be a good idea if I want to introduce another claim? Another reason? Well, furthermore, if I'm trying to wrap everything together, like a conclusion. In addition, okay, similarly, that's another one, okay. The Dred Scott decision threatened to extend the property rights of slave owners throughout the country. Give me an example. And somebody mentioned something about, for example, slave owners claimed that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it unconstitutionally deprived them of their property rights. Okay? If the Dred Scott decision did anything, it corrected that error. Okay? Why did that threaten to create more controversy? Because that particular court decision threatened to do what? What was the big argument in the country at that time?
Slavery.
Not slavery in itself, but
Expansion of slavery.
it would threaten to further expand slavery. So there you got it. That court decision actually helped slave owners. Okay. Their argument was that the Missouri Compromise should have never existed, and Dred Scott actually basically set them loose. They could demand their property rights regardless of where they are. Reasoning, this threatened to do what? Expand the practice of slavery. So we got two reasons to address that question. And then we close it up with what? In conclusion. Best, most foolproof way to close up an essay is to simply write, in conclusion. And what are we doing? We're restating. In conclusion, the Dred Scott decision created further controversy in this country because, as was mentioned, it stripped the rights of blacks everywhere, and it actually, what's the right word? Strengthened the claims of slave owners as to whether they had the constitutional right to own slaves throughout the country and its territories. Should I expend any more energy into this? Should I bring you 3 claims or 4 claims? Why not? What? We have other essays to do, and after all, let's not forget, this one is worth how much? 10 points. Okay? If you're not quite clear, what do we mean by, and so, yeah, other teachers have taught you P on your papers. I use a different acronym, but it's the same thing. CER. Instead of point, I say claim. Establish a claim. Evidence, same thing. Evidence example. Okay, and instead of at the end explanation, I put reasoning. And it's the same. Establish a claim, back up your claim with evidence, demonstrate how this evidence proves. Okay, and you do this in the reasoning. You demonstrate how your evidence proves your claim. Okay, that's what you're doing. And then you're doing it again. And then if you have another claim, you're doing it again, because you don't need to be doing it twice with paper 1. So in case you're not quite clear, our hamburger bun is our thesis statement. That's how we open up our essay. That in very general terms, it's controversial because of this and because of this. And then we handle each one by one. We take our first claim. You're telling me why you feel it added to the controversy. We present evidence. You show me, and in the case of a FRQ, you are stating some sort of a what? Historical fact. And then in your reasoning, you're explaining to me how this fact, for example, proves this claim to be true. Are we on the same page? Do we understand this isn't hard? All right? So hamburger method, this allows you to I guess, stack things, to construct them in a way that you have an essay that works. And step by step, what you should be doing to put together an expository essay. So how would a argumentative essay be any different? Well, we have a diagram to explain that one as well. Let's go back to this question. The main cause of increasing sectional tensions in the years 1850-1856 was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So what are we really arguing here? Remind me.
Was the Kansas-Nebraska Act the main cause of sectional divide?
And let's read carefully. The question is not assuming whether it was a cause. The question is the argument is being made that what? It was the main cause. The most important, nothing else. That's what we're really arguing here. That's the importance of reading carefully. Okay? All right. So how do we put this one together? Using the hamburger model, using CER. This one's a little bit more complicated, but it's not impossible. And of course, it should be a little bit more complicated. After all, it is worth 20 points. So here, we're going to look at another diagram I've put together called the three-burger model. It's the same thing that we just finished talking about. Instead of the one burger, we're writing three burgers. Okay? Our first burger is, we're going to go along with the argument in the wording of the question. Okay? We're going to argue on behalf of that position that we find in the question. And again, what was the position that the prompt was taking?
That it was the main cause?
It was the main cause. And then when we're done there, after having provided some decent claims and evidence and reasoning, we're going to move on to our next burger. In this case, we are offering some people say counterclaim, some people say antithesis, and some people say rebuttal. The easiest way is the opposite of our argument, right? So what would be the core counterclaim here? That no, it was not it could have been a cause, but no, that's not what we're arguing. We're arguing what? There was the main cause. So no, it was not the main cause. And I'm going to provide a couple of claims that speak to that fact, backed up by evidence, and backed up with some pretty adequate reasoning on your behalf. And then we have the third paragraph. And the third paragraph is a little tricky, okay? It's the one that tends to be hardest for most students. Let me offer you another analogy before we move any further. Sometimes the three burgers work for some people, doesn't work for everybody. So here's an alternate model, an alternate analogy. I'm sure most of you at some point have seen a courtroom drama either on TV or in the movies, or maybe you actually saw one in real life, okay? And so are you familiar with the structure of how a trial works? Okay. So in a trial, we'll say it's a criminal trial, the state has brought up somebody on charges. Okay? The prosecutor's office has brought somebody on charges. Their job is to prove to the jury that this person is what? What? The prosecution? This person is guilty. So that's our argument, okay, that the defendant is guilty. So think of it this way. Think of the first hamburger as the prosecution. Prosecution is always first up to bat. Prosecution's job is to convince whom?
The jury?
The jury that the defendant is guilty. The defendant is guilty because of this and because of this, whatever those claims are. That's not enough. The prosecution also has to present to the jury what?
Evidence.
Evidence. Here's Exhibit A. Here's Exhibit B. And then the prosecution has to demonstrate how this evidence proves that claim. How this evidence is linked to the defendant and proves the claim that the defendant is guilty because of this particular claim. And we're going to say one claim is not enough. There's other exhibits that furthermore prove that the defendant is guilty. Exhibit B, this proves our second claim why the defendant is guilty. Prosecution sits down. Who's next up to bat?
The defense.
Anybody? The defendant. That's our second hand. Hey, if your defense attorney is not trying to make it so that you're innocent, guess what they're not doing? Their job. Okay? They may even know that you're guilty. You might have admitted to them, but guess what? Guess what their job is? To prove you're innocent. So the defense's job is to convince the jury otherwise. That's why it's a rebuttal. It's a counterclaim. No. The defendant is actually innocent. He's not guilty. So that's a rebuttal to being guilty, being innocent. Just like the prosecution, the defense has their own claims to make and is going to back up their claims with evidence, right? Exhibit A, Exhibit B. You know? Here's his mom. His mom says that he was having dinner with her that night at that specific time. That's witness testimony, right? And that proves what? That there's no way he could have been at the scene. So that bit of evidence is proof that disproves the claim of the prosecution. So I don't want to tangle you up too much, but you get what I'm trying to say, right? This is the prosecution's job. This is the defense's job. Both sides offer claims, offer evidence, offer reasonings that tie that evidence to that claim made. Done. Everybody sits down. Who makes the final decision in a trial? The jury. That's our third paragraph. Third paragraph is the jury's job. The jury, throughout the course of the trial, considers the argument made by the prosecution, considers, that's not good. Considers the argument made by the defense, but ultimately has to do what? Choose a side. Not because, well, I just like this presentation more. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Choose a side, why? Because the evidence and the explanation was simply stronger, more reliable, more believable. Okay? And that's what you got to do in the third paragraph. You got to choose a side and then explain to the reader why that side is most true. And you also have to explain to the reader why you rejected what was wrong about the other side. And you are done. Okay? Is this the only way to do it? No. This is a model. This is a formula. This is a recipe. You can attempt to bake a cake or bake bread without a recipe, but guess what? You have a harder time of it. This is a recipe put in front of you. Follow these steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, and you should be able to pull it off. Okay? If we were using this to explain the one that Kansas, Nebraska was the main cause, for example, if we attempted to answer that in class, let's come back over here. Kansas, Nebraska. So if I were writing a thesis to open up that essay, yes, the Kansas-Nebraska Act can be interpreted to have been the main cause behind the sectional tensions in this country between 1850 and 1856. Why?
Because it caused like riots in Kansas.
It inspired violence among settlers in Kansas, violence that would eventually spill over and become what? The Civil War. What else did it do? It threatened to expand
Slavery.
slavery. So those are our two claims. We're not, we don't have a ton of time in the world, but then we would elaborate on those two claims. Yes, it was the main reason because it threatened to expand slavery, and it incited violence among settlers in Kansas, violence that would eventually spill over and become the Civil War. So absolutely, it sounds like the main cause to me. Rebuttal. What's a good way to start that? What's a good way to start if you're going to go in a different direction? It's a good phrase to start with. On the other hand, on the contrary, yeah. What are we going to say now? What's our job now? To challenge, to disprove the notion that what? Right, so give me some reasons why you believe that. What do you know? Fugitive Slave Act actually contributed more to the increasing sectional tensions than the Kansas-Nebraska Act did. Give me another reason. In addition, Ron, what if I were to surprise you with this question? Would you be ready? Other than the Fugitive Slave Act, which is a great idea, what else exists out there that could disprove the notion the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the main cause?
Missouri Compromise?
That's a bit, okay. The Missouri Compromise was proof going all the way back to when? 1820. That sectional tensions were already well underway. Perfect. So we got a couple of claims that back up our argument. Got a couple of claims that back up our counter argument. Elaborate on those guys. Offer evidence. And then the last one, there really is no right or wrong answer. But do a good job. Do a convincing job when you tell me which one of the two you sided with and why. Okay? Here's a question of just like effort. You make a convincing job of it. Okay? Any questions? So how do you know this, Mr. Hernandez? How do you know what makes a good essay and what doesn't make a good essay? You'll have access to it. You have access to it too. That's because Cambridge told me. And how did Cambridge go about telling me what makes a good essay and what makes a bad essay? Because Cambridge shows me a rubric. Another classic. Rubrics are what teachers use to quantify and therefore grade essays. Cambridge is a lot less demanding than AP. Okay? Yes, there are points awarded per level, but every level is pretty broadly described. Okay? That means it leaves a lot in the hands of whom? Whoever's reading it. If the person reading it feels that your essay matches the description in that level, then that reader is free to give you the number of points anywhere within that range of points. Okay? Let's look at this. Now let's play around with it. So let's go back to essay A, our expository essay. Would you say there's anything that stands out as far as a difference between a level 1, level 2 essay and a level 3, level 4 essay? Anybody?
Level 2 or 3 says that you demonstrated good knowledge.
Good knowledge and
And 1 testimony.
some knowledge. Right here, that's good. Yeah, he knows something. Versus knows their stuff, right? Any other differences you see between these two levels and these two levels? That wasn't one I was expecting, but it is very good. Knows their stuff well, knows their stuff to an extent. Anything else you notice?
1 and 2 that says describes, and then 3 and 4 says explain it, connects the factors.
If you're describing something, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. This is not a descriptive essay. What is it? It's an expository essay. What's the difference between describing and explaining something? Describe this.
Black.
Usually a lot of adjectives come to mind, right? It's black, it's metal, it has wheels, it's a cart. But that's not the same as explaining it. Because explaining it, I have to discuss its function, right? Why does this exist? What does it do? Then I'm not talking about adjectives, right? I'm explaining its purpose. What's its purpose? Huh? To hold stuff, to transport stuff. There's a big difference between explaining something and describing something. If you find yourself describing, you're level 1, level 2. Explain, in this case, why the Dred Scott case was controversial. Explain. Don't describe, how people might have felt about it. What else are we looking at? So let's look at 3 and 4. We know these two are descriptive. We know these two don't demonstrate good knowledge about the subject. We want to aim high. So let's look at these two. What do you think separates 4 from 3? And I see something that catches my eye. Let's see if it catches yours. The main difference between a level 3 and a level 4.
It connects the factors to the claim.
Okay. It connects the fact or the evidence to the claim. That's what they're trying to say. These are synonyms. Quite often we use them. What they call factors, we call evidence or examples. Yes, they should be tied to the claim, absolutely. Notice anything else that separates the two guys from each other? That's what it is. The only level where I actually see the word conclusion show up is where? Level 4. If you're not writing a conclusion, okay, which in prompt A is easy. It's basically a restatement of what? Of your thesis. If you're not writing a conclusion, I don't see how you get a level 4. If you don't demonstrate a clear understanding of the connections, okay, between things, you're not getting a level 4. So level 4 is well focused. Oh, and by the way, how many claims to get are you just offering one claim? Offering a range of claims. That's anything more than one. So that's our paper 1 rubric. How about our paper 2 rubric? Remember our paper 2 question. To what extent was Kansas-Nebraska Act the main cause of sexual tensions? We didn't have time to do it. In one of the workshops, they gave us an example argumentative question. Too bad we didn't get it. I did it with an earlier period. To what extent is a hot dog a sandwich? That's an argument. And there's plenty of material to say, yes, meat between 2 breads. And what would be a rebuttal to that? No, the meat's the wrong shape. Sandwich meat tends to look a certain way, and a hot dog is what? So, okay, we'll hold that one off to the side. That would have been a good question. So let's look at this rubric. And what separates a good response from a bad response? Let's look at the bad ones first, right? If you didn't even write anything here, or anything that addressed the question whatsoever, it's not there. So you don't want to get level 0. It would be really hard to get level. I mean, you have to try to get level 0. It happens. I'm not gonna lie to you. Level 1, you're either describing or partial responses. Okay. You're not doing the 3 hamburgers. Maybe you did 1. Okay. Level 2, responses show some understanding of the question. Here's that word again, some understanding. Some understanding of the focus of the question. Either entirely descriptive, or they have some explicit comment with relative but limited support. So there's a little bit there, but it's not enough. Okay, there's something going on there, but it's not enough. Everybody still with me? What about level 3? A, B, C, D, E. If you wanted to attach a Cambridge grade scale to it. What would be a C paper if we were to use that? There's a developed understanding of the question, provides some assessment. That means there was some attempt to write a third paragraph. Okay. However, and I would say this is the biggest telltale sign, the biggest telltale sign of a paper simply not making it to level 4. Lack of depth or lack of balance. Lack of balance meaning you never bothered to do what? Look at both sides of what?
The argument.
Of the argument. Or you did so, but it just was not a very good job. And then unfortunately, what I often find myself having to address over and over again. I do find myself writing the word vague a lot in many papers. Vague and lacking depth is the same thing. And when I feel that I have to write lacks depth or vague, what do you figure I'm running into? Students that are not quite informed about the subject, a lack of detail, a lack of explicit understanding. If I'm getting a lot of wishy-washy, cloudy, more or less, that's lacking depth. The best you could possibly do is a level 3. If that's what I'm picking up from your paper, that you really don't know. How do we avoid that? No. Study material so that you know, so you are prepared to offer explicit, specific knowledge. It's tough. These are huge demands. It's Cambridge. It's supposed to be rigorous. It's supposed to be demanding. And you're here because you're supposed to be here. Let's get a little bit better. What do you think is the difference between a 4 and a 5? What stands out to you? A 4 obviously has to be what? Balanced. If you're not trying to argue, look at both sides, then guess what? You're not getting to a 4. Okay. At a minimum, a level 4, you considered both sides of the argument. And you demonstrated an explicit understanding of the question. A balanced argument supported by a good range of evidence. That means just one claim and one bit of evidence? No. You have to offer what? At least more than one. What really separates a 4 from a 5 is right here. The judgment part. Just beginning to form a judgment. The jury part. Okay? It's just something about it is a bit partial or not fully supported. So what's really separating a 4 from a 5 is that third paragraph. Is it, wow, impressive? You are hitting all the notes, or does it need work? And because of the way the rubric is written, that puts a lot of that at the discretion of whom? Of the reader. Okay. Level 5. Answers lead to a relevant conclusion judgment which is developed and supported. To me, that's what separates a 4 from a 5. A really good job in the third paragraph. You're telling me which of the two is most valid and why, and you're also telling me why you rejected the other one. We good? Is this helping a bit? I hope so. Let's look at our syllabus for a second. So we are correct with the timing. Because the next issue is, Mister, where do I pour how much energy do I pour into each essay, and how do I know how much energy and effort I should pour into each essay? So yeah, an hour and 45 minutes. That's 60, 70, 80, 90, 105 minutes. 105 minutes for 4 prompts. Half of 105 would be 52.5. And I'm giving you 60 minutes. So forget the math we did earlier, okay? Half of paper 2 should be about 52 minutes. I'm giving you a little bit more, 60 minutes. So if I have 60 minutes to play with, how should I divide it? If I know this is 10 points, and this is 20.
Should be the first 10 minutes.
No, that's wrong. Should be 15. I think it was 35. Either way. All right, so as far as energy, effort, how much should I dedicate? If you wanted to match up the numbers, about 17.5 minutes, no more than that on your expository essay. That goes by quickly. And about 35 minutes, no more than that, on your argument. And in that 17.5 minutes or 35 minutes, and of course this is a very fuzzy number. It could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less. It's just a rough guideline. You also need to work into their what? Planning. That's the important part. Please never let ink touch that paper without first doing what? Planning. You guys, when you were little, used to watch a lot of Dora. I know your age group. Dora never went anywhere without what? Her map. That's your map. Like all maps, it keeps you from getting lost. We don't want you to get lost. We want you to stay focused. To stay focused, you're going to do 2 things before you even begin writing that essay response. You're going to write the prompt. You're going to be mindful of what that prompt says, the wording of that prompt. That's your lighthouse. That keeps you focused on what you're supposed to be doing. And then you're going to put together a plan. It doesn't have to be a long, elaborate one. You can be basic with a couple of bullets, but it's important. Because as you write, you refer to your plan. And as long as you stick to the plan, you won't get what? You won't get lost. You won't lose focus. You won't find yourself talking about things that were never part of the question to begin with. Because you planned ahead. So please, let's make a promise. We never shoot from the hip. I don't want to read any streams of consciousness. Okay? You answer what you need to answer, you get to the point, you are concise, and you plan ahead. It's very important because it's a very common mistake. People losing focus along the way. And as long as we have our heads together and screwed on straight and we do planning and we write our prompt, we should not lose focus. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. We're almost done, but not quite. I don't think we're going to have time to go over a student response. Maybe we could go over like a bit of a student response. But for fear of losing time, I do want to address something. All right, so we scrolled too much here. some best practices, some good advice before you start writing the essay. Number one, stay focused. If you need a little help, look at that prompt. Look at the planning that you did. Answer that question and only that question, and be clear what that question is trying to tell you. Okay, that's some of the best advice I could give you for this essay. Your argument, when you're doing an argumentative, remember, when you are arguing for, everything you say on that side of the essay needs to be an argument for. When you're arguing against, everything you say there needs to be against. Don't put me in a position to have to write down you were contradicting yourself. And it happens sometimes. When you state something that, hey, that should have been on the other side of the argument. Are you clear with, what belongs in the argument side, what belongs in the counter-argument side? And we usually fix that in the planning stages. You know what a contradiction is, right? When you say something that actually is counter to what you're trying to argue. Be specific and detailed, not vague and general. Don't make me have to write this all over your paper. And how do we avoid this? By being prepared. That's right. Be clear. Try to avoid awkward or odd wording. And sometimes this happens from a good place. You're trying to impress them. You want to use big words. Sometimes it's not the right word. And it creates some confusion. If you're not quite sure if that's the right word, keep it simple. I won't penalize you for keeping it simple, but I will penalize you if I have no idea what you're trying to say here. And then you're confusing with the rest of the essay. Don't narrate, don't storytell, don't describe. If you find yourself doing this, then you are doing it wrong. Prompt A, you should be explaining, only explaining. If you're not sure what explaining is, look it up. It's there. Explaining is very different than describing. Explaining, you're talking about function, how something works, how something came to be. And when you're arguing, you're arguing. Since we're talking about history, we should always write about history in past tense. If we're going to use facts as our examples, we better make sure our facts are historically accurate. Oh, Mr. Hernandez will never know. I've been doing this a long time. I'm going to know if you're trying to make stuff up. Okay? This is important, particularly with our third paragraph that sounds like an opinion. No personal pronouns. You will not write in first person. Understand? The word I, my, me, myself should never show up. You are writing third person impersonal. Even when you are evaluating and judging at the end of your prompt B essay. Understood? Before I get to 9, it was actually a 9 and then it was a 10. Handwriting. If you know your handwriting is not easy on the eyes or on the readers, what would I suggest you do? Anybody? Skip lines. You know what's the best medicine for difficult handwriting? Write. Write more. How many of you keep journals? Write letters. Really think about how often do you write? If it's not often and your handwriting is difficult, guess what I would suggest to you? Start writing. You will be amazed over time what's going to happen to your handwriting. On top of the fact that you kids don't know how to write cursive unless you were educated elsewhere. And those educated elsewhere have wonderful handwriting because they used to stress that a lot, even when I went to school. And, well, give or take, you guys know how to type. Nobody knew how to type 20 years ago. People like pecked for letters on the keyboard. Nobody knew what they were doing. Now, you guys are naturals. Type. So we lost a little bit somewhere. We gained something else somewhere else. But handwriting, if it's difficult to read, skip lines. I'm going to tell you something that's very harsh. And it applies to handwriting too. Attractive people do better in life. They get the job, they get promotions, they get raises. The table's kind of set for them. Now, I know it sounds unfair. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are unfair. And the same thing for handwriting. Attractive handwriting. Guess who likes it better? Readers. And guess what attitude readers tend to have towards essays that are well written and enjoyable to read because the handwriting is clear. They're going to get a certain advantage. And if your handwriting is difficult, do you really want to put yourself in the position of, perhaps you don't know that, being the last essay at the end of a very difficult day of essay reading, and here comes this last essay, and the reader first has to figure out, grab a Rosetta Stone and try to figure out what these hieroglyphics even mean before reading the essay. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. I'll tell you what that reader's going to do. Don't put yourself in that position. Work on your handwriting. Lastly, before you turn anything in, at least take a couple of minutes to do what? Proofread. Proofread your essay. What do we got? 20 minutes. I could show you one student response. And you get a taste of what I look at. Okay? Because you're used to seeing nicely typed, pages on books and websites. But when you're looking at people's handwriting, it's a very different story. So here's a question. I don't expect you to be knowledgeable about this. But it would have been a paper or two question that was asked a couple of years ago. Last year's Civil War and Reconstruction was a paper 1 question. This year's going to go back to being a paper 2 question. It doesn't matter if you know this or know what the answer is. At this point, you should already pick up that a prompt, regardless of the question, is written in what way? What kind of an essay do we respond with? Expository. Why do I know this? Oh, look at the operative term. Every prompt, regardless of the topic, will always be written in the same way. Oh, look at the phrase. To what extent? It's always going to be to what extent or how far. It's setting up an argument. And of course, if you're setting up an argument, I respond with an argumentative essay. Let's look at this one. Explain why the involvement of foreign powers prolonged the Civil War. And so, without reading anything, I'm assuming that the student responding is going to offer me a couple of reasons why they felt this to be true, is going to back up these reasons with historical facts, and then is going to use these facts to reinforce the idea of whatever their claim was. That's the way it works. You establish a claim, you provide evidence, and the purpose of that evidence in your reasoning is to demonstrate how it proves the claim. We can do this in a couple of minutes. I think it's here. I'm going to be speed reading this a bit. The idea is not to know the specifics of the answer, but more like the spirit of the question and the question type and how to go about answering this. And of course, looking at a student response. So, right off the bat, he starts with an initial claim. If we remember the question, do I remember the question? Do you remember the question, what it was? To what extent did foreign involvement, I think it's something along those lines, to what extent did foreign involvement prolong the Civil War? Right. So, bam, claim 1. To begin, and that's a great way to start. The involvement of foreign powers prolonged the Civil War because, claim number 1, it allowed the South to hold out for so long. That's their initial claim. Okay, thank you. Now, what should the student be giving me next? Evidence. All right, tell me how it is you came to that conclusion. What evidence do you have? It's pretty elaborate. The South could continue the war of attrition for longer. During the Civil War, the North had a naval blockade on the southern coast as part of their Anaconda Plan. A little bit descriptive and unnecessary, but fine. This was meant to squeeze the South economically. As the war went on, the naval blockade grew tighter, and this made it harder for the Confederacy to buy goods abroad. The Confederacy had way less factories than the North, so it couldn't manufacture weapons. Britain was hesitant to join in the war effort, so technically remained neutral. Okay, it was a bit of a focus problem, and this is not a perfect score, by the way. In that the students are doing a little bit more narration than was necessary. It's supposed to be telling me how Britain's involvement extended the war for the South. That's what he should be focused on. Kind of giving me a background story. All right, no big deal. Were involved through the use of blockade runners. Blockade runners were British ships that got supplied in the Confederacy. They got around the naval blockade and had the advantage of surprise attack. They had a 78% success rate. That's very explicit knowledge. The use of these materials, the Confederacy helps hold for as long, desperate, hot. See, that's the thing. Despite not being able to get goods abroad, reading handwriting is very different. This is some of the nicer stuff. That's not bad handwriting. So somewhere here, I got evidence, and I think his evidence was the blockade runner. And then I got a broader explanation of how this helped the South stay in the war longer. Now, I'm going to get another claim, right? I could know this by the way this new paragraph starts, right? So there were also some other ways, such as through commerce raiders and the Trent Affair. Okay, so that's claim number 2. And now what I should be getting is examples and reasoning. Because Britain made its status a belligerent power, they couldn't supply the Confederacy with warships, but how they got around, They used the Steno Affair. And then, so somewhere there was both the claim, shorter, something tells me he spent more time on A than he should have, because then now he's wrapping it up with what? Overall, well, actually overall, then pretty good predictor. What am I gonna read now? A conclusion, right? British involvement using blockade runners had the biggest impact on prolonging the war, because the North had so many advantages over the South, like greater manpower, naval supremacy, better economy, They were able to help. So here are some of the notes. You got 8 out of 10. So nearly perfect. Nearly perfect. Let's see, without reading the whole thing, and it does continue. So it's a lengthy conclusion. And remember, you're not going to get a level 4 without writing some sort of a conclusion, wrapping it all together. And I don't want the announcements to interrupt me here. But here, and I gave you a link. You can see, you can read this at home. Some of the notes that the readers made as to, why 8 and not a 10. The response started with a clear statement that foreign involvement in the Civil War allowed the South to hold out for longer. The answer became more generalized with a reference to the North's naval blockade and the problems it created. The explained factors evidence dealt with the roles played by blockade runners and commerce raiders. I felt that he put the evidence after the reasoning. There was confusion shown in the description of the Trent Affair, and there was no link established how it prolonged the Civil War. The concluding paragraph, the last one, offered the explanation blockade runners provided a counterbalance to the North's advantage in material. The response could have assessed level 4 if it had shown the connection between various explained factors. A widening of the discussion of foreign involvement to include France as well as England would have made the response more secure. All right, so that was an example. I don't expect you to know anything about this yet. But I don't know if you were following along. We pretty much checked every box that I was telling you in that hamburger. So this is pretty much the conclusion. This was our long talk of how to write a Cambridge essay. Do I have any questions or doubts? So, yes.
So for the second essay, you don't need to write an introduction.
You never write an introduction. Never. Don't confuse that with a thesis statement. One thing is an introduction, and one thing is an opening statement that addresses the prompt. That's what I want you to open with, not with an introduction. Anything else? No? So we're confident. So Friday, so I'm going to hit you Friday with the questions, and we'll be ready. We'll see.